Between June 1975 and December 1976, 9 men died across the remote hollows of Cocke County, Tennessee, in what would later be called the Appalachian Moonshine War. All adults, all connected to a single moonshine operation. The method was varied. Vehicle accidents on mountain roads that weren't accidents, falls from ridges that defied explanation, rifle shots from distance that came from darkness. The perpetrators weren't rival gangs or federal agents. They were 3 brothers from the Slade family, moving through the mountains like smoke, methodically erasing everyone connected to something that had been stolen from them. The Tennessee Bureau of Investigation would later call it one of the most calculated campaigns of elimination in eastern Tennessee history. But the motive wasn't territory, wasn't a drug war, wasn't even revenge for violence. It was a copper still, a moonshine still that had been in the Slade family for 43 years, stolen by men they'd once considered neighbors. If you have the courage to hear this story, leave your like and subscribe to the channel. But I warn you, this narrative contains extreme violence based on real events. Greer's Hollow, Cocke County, Tennessee, wasn't much more than a fold in the mountains where Big Creek ran clear and cold, before joining the Pigeon River 8 miles downstream. Population scattered across maybe 15 square miles of steep terrain, where the Smoky Mountains gave way to narrow valleys thick with oak, hickory, and mountain laurel. The nearest real town, Newport, sat 12 miles north on roads that turned to mud when it rained and ice when winter came early. Most folks in Greer's Hollow had never been farther than Knoxville, 40 miles west. The mid-1970s meant temperatures dropping to freezing at night, by late autumn, rising to maybe 55 by afternoon. The air smelled like wood smoke from coal stoves, damp leaves rotting on the forest floor, and that particular sharp scent of approaching winter that people who live in the mountains learn to recognize by blood memory. But 1975 was a hard year in eastern Tennessee. The logging industry that had sustained these mountains for generations was dying, mechanization eliminating jobs, companies pulling out and leaving behind families with no way to make a living. In Cocke County, unemployment hit 27% that fall. For men who'd grown up believing that hard work guaranteed survival, watching the economy collapse felt like a betrayal of everything they'd been promised. In places like Greer's Hollow, moonshine wasn't just a business. It was the economy, always had been. Federal taxes on legal liquor made it too expensive for mountain people, so they made their own, following recipes passed down through generations, using skills their grandfathers had brought from Scotland and Ireland 2 centuries before. The law said it was illegal. The mountains said it was survival, and in 1975, with no other jobs available, moonshining was the difference between feeding your family and watching them go hungry. Boone Slade was 46 years old that June. Though he looked older, he stood 6 feet tall, lean and ropey, with muscle built from decades of physical labor. His face was weathered like old leather, deep lines carved around his eyes from squinting into sun and smoke. His hands were massive, knuckles swollen from old breaks that had never set quite right, calluses thick as boot leather. When he shook your hand, you felt the strength there, but also the damage, the accumulated cost of mountain living. Every morning, Boone woke at 5 o'clock in the house his grandfather had built in 1927, made coffee in a percolator on a wood stove, and sat at the kitchen table smoking hand-rolled cigarettes while he planned his day. He didn't talk much in those early hours, just sat, smoked, drank coffee so strong it could strip paint, and thought. By 5:30 he'd be out the door, checking the still hidden 3 miles back in the woods, following trails only he and his brothers knew. He'd married Clara Jean Whitson in 1952, right after he came home from Korea with nightmares and a scar along his ribs where shrapnel had missed his liver by 2 inches. They'd had 3 daughters, all grown now, all married and moved to Knoxville or beyond, looking for something the mountains couldn't provide. Clara was 44, her hands as work-worn as Boone's, her face still beautiful despite everything the mountains had demanded from her. What Boone valued most wasn't money, he'd never had much anyway. What he valued was continuity, the unbroken line connecting him to his grandfather, to his father, to the land they'd worked and the craft they'd perfected. His grandfather, Amos Slade, had built their copper still during Prohibition, back when making liquor was both an act of rebellion and an act of survival. That still had kept the Slade family afloat through the Depression, through wars, through every economic catastrophe the 20th century had thrown at the mountains. The still itself was a work of art, though Boone would never have used that word. 60-gallon copper pot, custom-built condensing coils, everything fitted and soldered by hand. Copper was valuable, always had been. A good still represented hundreds of hours of work, metal that cost real money, craftsmanship that couldn't be taught from books. But more than that, a still represented time, the accumulated labor of seasons, the investment of years. When you looked at a still, you weren't seeing equipment. You were seeing history, seeing every batch run through it. Every winter survived because of what it produced. Boone's grandfather had worked copper mines in his youth, had learned to shape metal, had built the still with his own hands in 1932, passed it to Boone's father in 1948, passed it to Boone in 1967, and someday Boone had intended to pass it to someone who valued what it represented: continuity, craft, survival. His brothers worked the operation with him. Harlan Slade, 43, shorter than Boone at 5'10", but built solid, with a barrel chest and arms thick from years of manual labor. Harlan had stayed in Tennessee when Boone went to Korea, had kept the family operation running, had married a girl named Nadine who'd given him 2 sons before dying of pneumonia in 1963. Harlan lived alone now, his sons grown and gone, working construction jobs in Chattanooga. He was quiet like Boone, but where Boone's silence came from calculation, Harlan's came from a deep well of sadness he'd never fully processed. And then there was Curtis, the youngest at 39, tall and thin as a rail, with nervous energy that kept him moving even when there was nowhere to go. Curtis had never married, lived in a trailer on the family property, worked odd jobs when he could find them, and helped his brothers with the still. Together, the 3 Slade brothers formed a unit that had operated seamlessly for years, each knowing his role, each trusting the others completely. The still they'd inherited sat hidden in a hollow 3 miles from the nearest road, accessible only by foot trail, protected by terrain that discouraged casual exploration. They'd been running it for 8 years without significant trouble, producing quality moonshine that sold quietly through networks established generations before. The location was known only to them, or so they'd believed. The still represented not just income, but identity, the only inheritance the Slade family had to offer, the only proof that their lives had accumulated to something beyond survival. That still was the physical manifestation of 43 years of family history, of labor, of secrets kept and traditions maintained. It was irreplaceable, not because copper couldn't be bought, but because the time invested in its operation could never be recovered. On the morning of June 12, 1975, a Thursday when the temperature hit 72 and the air was thick with humidity, Boone Slade walked the 3 miles to check the still and found nothing. Not damaged, not vandalized, gone. The clearing where it had sat for 8 years was empty, except for the stone foundation they'd built to support it and the cold ashes from the fire they'd used 3 days before. The ground showed signs of disturbance, multiple boot prints, marks where something heavy had been dragged. Boone stood in the clearing for 20 minutes, not moving, not speaking, just looking at the empty space where 43 years of his family's history had been. His hands were steady, but something cold settled in his chest. something that felt like the moment in Korea when he'd understood that the man shooting at him was trying to end his life, and there would be no negotiation, no appeal to reason, just survival or death. He walked back to the house, called his brothers. They returned to the clearing together, examined the evidence. Harlan found a torn piece of fabric caught on a tree branch. Looked like work shirt material, blue denim. Curtis found tire tracks a half-mile away, where the trail widened enough for a truck. Looked fresh, probably from earlier that week. They tracked the drag marks as far as they could, lost them where the ground turned to stone. Someone had taken their still, had spent hours doing it, had known exactly where to look and how to move it without being seen. This wasn't a federal raid. Agents would have destroyed the still on site, would have left citations, would have made their presence known. This was theft, pure and simple. Someone had stolen 43 years of accumulated labor and family history. Boone reported the theft to the Cock County Sheriff's Department on June 13th. He drove to Newport, walked into the office, told Deputy Frank Messer that someone had stolen his property. He didn't mention it was a still, just described it as copper equipment worth substantial money. Messer, who'd grown up in Cock County and understood exactly what Boone was talking about, without specifics being spelled out, made a notation in his incident log but didn't seem particularly concerned. "Maybe you should have hidden it better," Messer said, not unkindly, just stating what he considered obvious fact. Lot of copper theft going on these days, price is up, people see opportunity. Boone looked at him, saw in the deputy's face a fundamental misunderstanding of what had been taken. Messer saw equipment, saw metal that could be valued by weight and market price. He didn't see history, didn't see time, didn't see the erasure of something that couldn't be replaced. "I want it back," Boone said quietly. "Whoever took it, they need to return it." Messer shrugged. "File a report if you want, but I'll be honest with you, Boone. We don't have resources to investigate every piece of missing equipment. You want my advice? You buy new copper and you hide it better next time." Boone stood there for a long moment, understanding with terrible clarity that the law wouldn't help him, that the system designed to protect property and punish theft didn't recognize what he'd lost because officially it shouldn't have existed in the first place. He walked out of the sheriff's office without filing a report, drove home, sat at his kitchen table with his brothers. "They're not going to help," Boone said. Harlan nodded slowly, had expected as much. "So what do we do?" Curtis looked from one brother to the other. "We find it ourselves. Can't be that many people who'd know where it was and have the balls to take it." Over the next 2 weeks, the Slade brothers did their research. Quiet research, the kind mountain people excel at. They talked to people who talked to people, followed rumors, listened to conversations in places where men gathered. By late June, they'd narrowed it down. Walter Hutchins ran a moonshine operation in the next hollow over, about 7 miles from the Slade property. Hutchins was younger, 38, ambitious in ways that didn't fit traditional mountain operations. He'd expanded aggressively over the past 2 years, brought in new people, sold to buyers in Knoxville and beyond. The Slade brothers had known about Hutchins, had considered him competition but not a threat. They'd never had trouble with him, had occasionally traded information about federal activity in the area. On June 28th, Boone made a discovery that changed everything. He was in Newport buying supplies when he ran into Tom Bagwell, who worked sporadically for various moonshine operations doing odd jobs, hauling sugar and corn, things that didn't require particular skill but paid in cash. Tom was drunk at 2 in the afternoon, sitting outside the feed store, and when he saw Boone, something flickered across his face. Not quite guilt, not quite fear, something in between. Boone sat down next to him. "You been working for Walter Hutchins?" Tom took a long drink from a bottle in a paper bag. "Yeah, on and off, pays decent." "He get any new equipment recently?" Tom looked away. I don't know nothing about that, Boone. Tom, I'm not asking as a friend. I'm asking as someone who's owed something. Did Walter Hutchins acquire a copper still in the past few weeks? The silence that followed told Boone everything he needed to know. Tom wouldn't meet his eyes, just stared at the ground, hands shaking slightly. I didn't have nothing to do with taking it, Tom said finally. I just helped move it after it showed up. Walter said he bought it off someone, said it was legal. Where is it now? Can't tell you that, Boone. I give up that information. Walter will end me. Boone stood up, looked down at Tom Bagwell, a man he'd known for 20 years, who'd eaten at the Slade table, who'd been given work when nobody else would hire him. You tell Walter I want my property back. You tell him I'm giving him one chance to return it. No questions asked, no consequences. After that, there will be consequences. Tom nodded, not looking up. Boone walked away, knowing Tom would deliver the message, but doubting it would matter. 3 days later, Harlan was in Newport when he saw it. He'd stopped at a garage where a friend worked, was talking about truck problems when he glanced into the work bay and saw distinctive copper coils being used as decorative elements on a custom manifold someone was building. Harlan recognized them immediately, recognized the specific way the joints were soldered, the patina that came from decades of use. Those coils had come from the Slade still, no question. He asked the mechanic, Lester Hayes, where he'd gotten the copper. Walter Hutchins sold them to me last week, said he was scrapping out an old still, offered me the copper cheap. I figured I'd use it for this custom job I'm working on. Harlan felt something cold settle in his chest, the same thing Boone had felt standing in the empty clearing. Walter Hutchins hadn't just stolen their still. He'd already started dismantling it, selling pieces, erasing 43 years of family history for scrap value. On July 2nd, 1975, all three Slade brothers drove to Walter Hutchins' property. It was just past 6 in the evening, sun still up but sinking toward the ridgeline, temperature dropping from the day's high of 78 degrees. Hutchins' place sat at the end of a dirt road that wound through thick forest, a clearing with a house trailer, 2 storage sheds, and a barn that had seen better days. Walter's truck was parked outside. Smoke rose from a chimney despite the season. The Slade brothers parked 50 yards away, walked up to the trailer. Boone knocked. Heavy, deliberate knocks that left no doubt this was serious business. Walter Hutchins answered, saw the 3 Slade brothers, and something changed in his face. He was a big man, 6'3", maybe 240, with a red beard and hands stained with what might have been copper residue. Boone, Harlan, Curtis. He nodded to each in turn. What brings you out this way? You know why we're here, Boone said. His voice was quiet, calm, but carried an edge that made Walter's hand move unconsciously toward the doorframe. We're here for our still, the one you took from our property 3 weeks ago. Walter's face went carefully neutral. I don't know what you're talking about. The copper still that's been in my family for 43 years. The one you stole, the one you're already scrapping out and selling for parts. I saw the coils at Lester Hayes's garage. I recognized my grandfather's soldering work. Walter leaned against the doorframe, crossed his arms. That still came to me through legal channels. I bought it fair and square from someone who said it was theirs to sell. You got a problem with that. Take it up with them. Who'd you buy it from? That's my business, not yours. Boone took a step closer. I'm going to say this once, Walter. That still belongs to my family. Has for 4 decades. You return it today, right now, and we walk away. No trouble, no hard feelings. You keep it, and there will be consequences. Walter laughed. Not genuine amusement, but something harsher. Consequences? Boone, you're standing on my property making threats. I got 6 men working for me who'd be happy to escort you off if you don't leave peaceable. You want to talk about consequences. Think about what happens when you come to a man's land and accuse him of theft without proof. Harlan stepped forward. We got proof. We got your words right here, admitting you have our still. I admitted I have a still. I didn't admit I stole nothing. And even if I did, you think the sheriff's going to do anything? You think Frank Messer's going to arrest me over moonshine equipment that ain't supposed to exist in the first place? You already went to him, didn't you? And he told you the same thing I'm telling you. You should have hidden it better. The words hung in the air like smoke. The Slade brothers stood there, 3 men who'd come seeking return of property that was rightfully theirs, being told that ownership didn't matter, that history didn't matter, that 43 years of accumulated time and labor had no value because they hadn't protected it adequately. Curtis started to say something, but Boone put a hand on his shoulder. We're leaving, but this isn't over, Walter. You've taken something that can't be replaced, and you're going to understand what that means. Walter Hutchins smiled, ugly and satisfied. Get off my property, and don't come back unless you want trouble you can't handle. The Slade brothers walked back to their truck, didn't speak during the drive home. But something had shifted, some line had been crossed. They'd followed the proper channels, had gone to the law, had approached the thief directly and given him a chance to make things right. Every avenue had been closed. The system didn't recognize their loss, and the thief didn't fear consequences. What Boone Slade understood, sitting at his kitchen table that night with his brothers, was that they'd been erased. The still was gone, being dismantled, sold for scrap. The history it represented was being destroyed, and nobody cared because officially it had never mattered. His grandfather's work, his father's legacy, his own investment of time and knowledge, all of it reduced to copper valued by weight. Harlan said what they were all thinking. If we don't get it back, if we let this go, we're done. Word gets around that the Slades let someone steal their operation, we become targets. Every opportunistic bastard in 3 counties will think they can take from us. I know, Boone said. Curtis looked at his brothers. So what are we going to do? Boone was quiet for a long time, thinking about Korea, about choices made under impossible circumstances, about the difference between what the law said was right and what survival demanded. We're going to teach Walter Hutchins what it costs to steal from the Slade family, and we're going to make sure everyone else understands the lesson. That night, July 2nd, 1975, the Slade brothers made a decision that would claim 9 lives over the next 18 months and transform them from moonshiners into something the mountains would remember long after they were gone. The first death came 6 weeks later, on August 14th, 1975. Bobby Jean Farmer, 29 years old, worked for Walter Hutchins hauling supplies and occasionally helping run batches. He'd been with Hutchins for about 8 months, was known around Newport as someone who'd do work that asked no questions for cash, that left no record. Bobby lived in a rental house off Highway 321, drove a 1967 Ford pickup that burned oil and needed a new transmission. He wasn't particularly close to Hutchins, just needed money and didn't mind illegal work. On that Thursday afternoon, Bobby was driving back from Knoxville with 200 pounds of sugar in 50-pound bags, supplies for Hutchins' operation. The road between Knoxville and Newport wound through mountains, steep grades, tight curves, places where attention mattered. At approximately 4:15 in the afternoon, Bobby's truck left the road on a curve above Pigeon River. The vehicle went through a guardrail that had been there since 1962, dropped 40 feet, rolled twice, and came to rest upside down in shallow water. The Tennessee Highway Patrol investigated, determined that the cause was likely mechanical failure, combined with excessive speed for conditions. The truck's brake lines showed signs of wear, though the investigator noted they appeared to have failed catastrophically rather than gradually. Bobby Jean Farmer died on impact, neck broken, chest crushed by the truck's collapsed cab. He was 29 years old, left behind a girlfriend who was 4 months pregnant, parents who'd buried 2 other children already. The funeral was held at Mountain View Baptist Church. Walter Hutchins attended, stood in the back, didn't speak to the family. The Slade brothers did not attend. 3 days after the funeral, Walter Hutchins received a phone call. He answered, heard nothing but breathing for 10 seconds, then a voice. Boone Slade's voice, quiet and calm. "That's one. You've got 8 men working for you. Every one of them is going to pay the price for what you stole, and then you're going to pay it yourself. You want this to stop. You know what you need to do." Walter hung up the phone, stood in his kitchen trying to decide if Boone was bluffing. Bobby's death had been an accident. The highway patrol said so. Brake failure, bad luck. Nothing suspicious. But Walter had grown up in these mountains, understood how accidents could be arranged, how brake lines could be cut in ways that looked like wear. He told himself Boone was trying to scare him, trying to claim credit for random tragedy. He didn't return the still. On September 3, 1975, James Earl Tucker went missing. He was 36 years old, worked for Hutchins doing maintenance on equipment, had been helping set up a new operation in a hollow near the Nantahala National Forest. James left his house on that Tuesday morning, told his wife Linda he'd be back by supper, drove off in his Chevy Blazer. He never came home. Linda waited until 8 o'clock, called Walter Hutchins, who said James had left the work site around 3 in the afternoon, said he had errands to run. Linda called the sheriff's department. Deputy Frank Messer took the report, said they'd keep an eye out, but grown men sometimes needed space. Maybe James would show up in a day or two. 4 days later, a hunter found James Earl Tucker's body in a ravine 3 miles from the nearest road. He'd been shot once, rifle round through the chest, had bled out where he fell. The medical examiner estimated time of death at sometime on September 3rd, probably late afternoon. The sheriff's department investigated, found James's Blazer parked on a logging road 2 miles from where his body was discovered. No witnesses, no physical evidence beyond the bullet, which was too damaged for useful forensic analysis. The case went cold within 2 weeks. James Earl Tucker left behind a wife and 3 children, ages 6, 9, and 12. Walter Hutchins attended the funeral, paid for the casket, helped Linda with immediate expenses. He told himself this was unrelated to Bobby's death. Told himself it was probably a hunting accident, someone who'd mistaken James for a deer and panicked. But when he got home from the funeral, his phone rang. Boone Slade's voice, same quiet calm. "That's 2, 7 more to go." Walter slammed the phone down, felt fear settling into his bones. He called a meeting with his crew, everyone who worked for him. There were 8 now, down from 10 with Bobby and James gone. He gathered them at his property on September 12th, told them they needed to be careful, watch their backs. Maybe someone was targeting them. "Who?" asked Dennis Crawford, 41, who'd worked for Hutchins longer than anyone, almost 3 years. "Could be the Slades. They've been making threats since that Still situation." "You mean the Still you stole from them?" This from Carl Messer, 33, no relation to Deputy Frank Messer, but knew the Slade family by reputation. Walter's face went red. "I bought that Still legal. I didn't steal nothing." "Boone Slade says different. Says it belonged to his family for 40 years. Says you're going to pay for taking it." "Boone Slade can say whatever he wants. I'm not giving it back. But if he's coming after my people, we need to be ready. Any of you see the Slades, any of you get approached by them, you call me immediately." The crew dispersed, uneasy, looking over their shoulders. 3 of them, Carl Messer, Tommy Wright, and Vernon Hayes, met privately after the meeting. "Bobby's death was no accident," Carl said. I looked at that truck before they hauled it away. Brake lines were cut clean, not worn. Someone sabotaged it. And James? Vernon asked. Hunting accident? James got shot in the chest from distance. That's not someone mistaking him for a deer. That's someone who knew how to shoot and wanted him dead. Tommy Wright, who was 26 and had only been working for Hutchins for 6 months, looked scared. So what do? We quit. We got no income. Jobs aren't exactly plentiful around here. Carl looked at the other two. We watch each other's backs. We don't go anywhere alone. And maybe we consider that Walter brought this on himself by stealing from the wrong people. On October 21st, 1975, Dennis Crawford was working alone at one of Hutchins' still sites deep in the woods, checking temperature and making adjustments. It was a Tuesday afternoon, temperature in the low 50s, overcast, that particular quality of late autumn light that makes everything look faded. Dennis had been there. Since 10 in the morning, would probably stay until 4 or 5, then hike the 2 miles back to where he'd parked his truck. Around 2 o'clock, he heard someone approaching through the woods, footsteps on dry leaves. He turned, expecting to see Walter or one of the crew. Instead, he saw Boone Slade standing 30 feet away, rifle in hand, pointed at the ground, but ready. "Afternoon, Dennis," Boone said. His voice was conversational, almost friendly. Dennis felt his blood turn to ice. "Boone, wasn't expecting to see you out here." "I expect you weren't. You know why I'm here?" Dennis swallowed hard. "I can guess. Walter Hutchins stole from my family, took something that can't be replaced. I gave him a chance to make it right. He refused. So now everyone who helps him, everyone who profits from what he took, they're going to understand what it costs. I didn't take your still, Boone. I didn't even know about it until after the fact. But you're using it now, aren't you? Running batches through my grandfather's copper, making money from my family's history." "It's just a still, Boone. It's just copper and—" The rifle came up so fast Dennis didn't have time to react. Boone's voice went cold. Don't tell me it's just copper. You know better. A still is time. My grandfather's time, my father's time, my time. 43 years of accumulated work. Walter stole that, and you're helping him profit from it." Dennis raised his hands slowly. "What do you want me to do?" "I want you to tell Walter that this ends when he returns what he took. Every piece, every coil, everything. Until then, everyone connected to him pays the price. And if he doesn't return it, then you all pay the full price." Dennis saw something in Boone's eyes that made him understand this wasn't a negotiation. This was a sentence being carried out. "I got a wife, Boone. I got 2 kids, please." Boone lowered the rifle slightly. "Bobby had a girlfriend. James had 3 kids. They paid for Walter's theft. You think you deserve different?" Dennis felt tears running down his face. "I'll quit. I'll walk away from Hutchins right now. I swear to God I'll never work for him again." "Too late for that. You made your choice when you kept working for him after Bobby died. You knew what was happening and you stayed anyway." The shot echoed through the hollow, sent birds scattering from trees, faded quickly in the thick forest. Dennis Crawford fell, the bullet entering just below his sternum, tearing through vital organs, killing him within 60 seconds. Boone Slade stood over the body for a moment, felt nothing, no satisfaction, no remorse, just the cold certainty that this was necessary, that Walter Hutchins needed to understand consequences, that the world needed to know the Slade family would not be erased without response. He walked away, following trails only he knew, leaving Dennis Crawford for the next person to find. The body was discovered 2 days later by Carl Messer, who'd gone to check on why Dennis hadn't shown up for a planned meeting. The sheriff's department investigated, found the bullet, determined it was a rifle round, probably .30-06. one of the most common hunting calibers in Tennessee. No witnesses, no physical evidence, no clear motive beyond the obvious fact that Dennis worked for a moonshine operation and that world carried its own dangers. Walter Hutchins stood at Dennis Crawford's funeral, watched Dennis's wife and 2 children cry, felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. That evening his phone rang. Boone's voice. "That's 3, 5 more than you." Walter's voice shook when he spoke. "You're a murderer, Boone Slade. You're killing innocent people." "There's no innocent people in this, Walter. Everyone working for you knows what you did. They chose to stay anyway. They chose profit over principle. Now they're paying for that choice. I'll go to the sheriff. I'll tell them everything. Go ahead. Tell Frank Messer that the Slade brothers are eliminating your crew over a moonshine still. See how seriously he takes it. See if he investigates a murder over illegal equipment." Walter knew Boone was right. The law wouldn't help, couldn't help, because officially none of this should exist. "What do you want?" "I told you what I want. Return what you stole, every piece. Do it tomorrow and this ends." "I can't. I sold most of it already. The copper's gone, scrapped, sold to buyers in 3 states. Silence on the line. Then Boone's voice, colder than before. "Then you've made your choice, and everyone connected to you will pay the price." The line went dead. Walter Hutchins sat in his kitchen, head in his hands, understanding that he'd miscalculated catastrophically. He'd thought Boone was bluffing, thought mountain men didn't actually follow through on threats, thought he could keep what he'd stolen without consequence. He'd been wrong. Over the next year, 6 more men died. Tommy Wright was killed in November 1975 when his truck was run off the road on Highway 32. The vehicle found at the bottom of a ravine. Tommy's body crushed beneath overturned metal. The highway patrol ruled it accidental driver error combined with wet road conditions. Vernon Hayes disappeared in January 1976. His body found 3 months later in the woods, decomposed beyond easy identification, cause of death listed as exposure, though his family insisted Vernon knew the mountains too well to get lost. Carl Messer died in March 1976, shot through a window of his house while watching television, the bullet coming from darkness, from distance, the shooter never identified. The sheriff's department investigated for 2 weeks, found nothing, filed it as unsolved. Raymond Porter, who joined Hutchins' crew in late 1975, died in May 1976, his car exploding when he started the engine, the blast so complete that investigators couldn't determine if it was mechanical failure or sabotage. Kyle Bennett was found dead in August 1976, apparent drowning in Big Creek, though friends noted Kyle was a strong swimmer and the water where he drowned was only 3 feet deep. Eddie Malone died in October 1976, fall from a ridge while supposedly hunting, his body discovered at the bottom of a 70-foot cliff with a broken neck and compound fractures. After each death, Walter Hutchins received a phone call, Boone's voice calm and emotionless, counting down. "That's 4, that's 5, that's 6. The calls became a rhythm of horror, each one a reminder that Boone Slade kept his word, that consequences were being paid in full. By November 1976, Walter Hutchins was the only one left. His entire crew was dead or had fled Cock County, the survivors understanding that working for Hutchins meant carrying a death sentence. Walter himself had become a ghost, barely leaving his property, drinking heavily, sleeping with a loaded shotgun next to his bed. He'd tried to leave Tennessee twice, packed his truck both times, gotten as far as the county line before turning back because running felt like an admission that Boone Slade had won. On December 3, 1976, a Friday evening when the temperature dropped to 26 degrees, and frost covered everything by dusk, Walter Hutchins sat in his trailer drinking whiskey that burned all the way down. His phone rang at 8:40. He knew who it would be, had been expecting the call for months. "Hello, Boone." "Hello, Walter. How are you feeling?" "How do you think I'm feeling? You eliminated 8 men, 8 people who had families, who had lives. I eliminated 8 people who chose to profit from theft. Who knew what you'd done and stayed anyway. They made their choice. And now it's my turn." "Now it's your turn," Boone agreed. "I gave you 18 months, Walter. 18 months to do the right thing, to return what you stole, to make this right. You chose not to. So yeah, now it's your turn." Walter took a long drink, felt the whiskey burn. "I can't give back what I don't have anymore. The still's gone, Boone. Sold, scrapped, gone. Eliminating me won't bring it back. I know, but it'll make sure nobody else ever thinks they can steal from the Slade family. So come on then. Come do what you're going to do. I'm tired of waiting." Boone was quiet for a moment. "You could leave. Get in your truck, drive to Kentucky or North Carolina, never come back. I won't follow you, Walter. You go, this ends. And everyone knows I ran. Everyone knows Boone Slade scared me off my own land. Better than being dead." Walter laughed, bitter and broken. "You know what's funny, Boone? That still wasn't even worth that much. Maybe $1,000 in copper, maybe 1,500. I sold it for scrap for $800. $800. And for that, 8 men are dead, and I'm about to be number 9. Was it worth it? All this death over $800? It was never about the money, Walter. It was about time. About 43 years of my family's history that you stole and sold for scrap. You didn't steal copper. You stole legacy. And legacy's worth 9 lives. Legacy's worth whatever it takes to protect it." The line went dead. Walter Hutchins sat in his trailer for another hour, drinking, thinking about the 8 men who'd died because he'd stolen a copper still, thinking about whether he should run or stay, thinking about how different his life might have been if he'd just returned the still that first week. At 9:50, he heard a truck approaching, saw headlights through his window. He picked up his shotgun, chambered around, walked to the door. When he opened it, he expected to see Boone Slade standing there with a rifle. Instead, he saw nothing, just empty driveway, his own truck, darkness beyond. He stepped out onto the porch, shotgun ready, scanning the tree line. The bullet hit him from 200 yards away, fired from a ridge he'd walked 100 times. From darkness, he couldn't penetrate. The round entered just above his heart, passed through lung and major vessels, killed him before he hit the ground. Walter Hutchins fell on his own porch, shotgun clattering next to him, blood pooling on wood he'd walked across 10,000 times. He died at 9:53 on December 3, 1976, the 9th and final victim of what would become known as the Appalachian Moonshine War. The Tennessee Bureau of Investigation opened an investigation in January 1977, looking at 9 deaths over 18 months, all connected to Walter Hutchins' Moonshine operation. They established pattern, established motive, established that the Slade brothers had the most to gain from Hutchins' destruction, but they couldn't establish proof. No witnesses, no physical evidence connecting any Slade to any death, no confession, nothing that would hold up in court. The lead investigator, Agent Thomas Reynolds, interviewed Boone Slade in February 1977. They sat at Boone's kitchen table, the same table where the decision had been made 18 months earlier, drinking coffee that could strip paint. "You know why I'm here," Reynolds said. Boone nodded. "I expect you're investigating Walter Hutchins' death and the deaths of his crew." 9 deaths in 18 months, all connected to one operation. That's not coincidence, Mr. Slade. "No, I expect it's not. Want to tell me what happened?" "Walter Hutchins stole from my family. Stole a copper still that had been ours for 43 years. I asked for it back. He refused. He and his people paid the price for that refusal. Reynolds set down his coffee cup carefully. You're confessing to 9 murders. I'm stating facts. Walter stole from us. 9 people connected to that theft died. I'm not confessing to anything specific. Did you eliminate those 9 people, Mr. Slade? Boone looked at the investigator, saw a man from outside the mountains, someone who understood law but not code, who saw murder where. Boone saw consequence. I protected my family's legacy. I made sure everyone understood that stealing from the Slades has a cost. How I did that, whether I did anything illegal, that's for you to prove, not for me to confess. Reynolds spent 3 months investigating, interviewed everyone who'd known the victims, examined every death scene, reviewed every piece of evidence. He found nothing that would convince a prosecutor to file charges. The deaths could all be explained as accidents or isolated incidents. The motive was clear, but motive without evidence was just theory. In May 1977, the investigation was closed, filed as unsolved with a notation that the Slade brothers remained persons of interest, but that insufficient evidence existed to proceed. Boone Slade was never charged, never arrested, never faced trial for what he'd done. Harlan and Curtis Slade, who'd helped their brother track and eliminate 9 men over 18 months, were similarly never charged. The 3 brothers continued living in Greer's Hollow, continued working odd jobs, continued surviving in mountains that had become quieter after the deaths, more careful. The stolen still was never recovered, had been sold for scrap, melted down, repurposed into things that would never make whiskey, that would never carry the history of the Slade family. Boone had protected his legacy by destroying everyone who'd profited from its theft. But the legacy itself was gone, sold for $800, scattered across 3 states in forms that couldn't be traced. Boone Slade lived another 31 years. He died in 2008, 79 years old, heart attack in his sleep. His funeral at Mountain View Baptist Church was attended by maybe 40 people, family mostly, a few old friends who remembered when the mountains operated by different rules. The preacher talked about Boone as a man who'd loved his family, who'd worked hard, who'd valued tradition. The 9 deaths were never mentioned. Harlan Slade died in 2013, 81 years old, lived his final years alone in the house where he'd grown up, where his wife had died 50 years earlier. Curtis Slade is still alive, 88 now, lives in a nursing home in Newport, has dementia that's erased most of his memory. On good days, he talks about growing up in the mountains. On bad days, he talks about blood and fire and men who died in the woods. The staff think he's confused, mixing up memories with nightmares. The Hutchins family scattered after Walter's death. His property was sold in 1978, bought by developers who turned it into a small subdivision. Today, there are 6 houses where Walter's trailer once stood. Families who know nothing about the Moonshine operation or the 9 men who died because of a stolen still. In Cock County, the story became legend, told in pieces, fragments shared in bars and around fires, never quite complete, never quite accurate, but carrying the essential truth that the Slade brothers had. Eliminated 9 men and gotten away with it. Some people said Boone was a murderer who'd killed innocent people in cold blood. Others said he was a man defending his family's legacy in a world where the law didn't recognize what had been stolen. The truth, as always, lived somewhere in between. The question that haunted Agent Thomas Reynolds, that haunted the families of the 9 victims, that haunted everyone who knew the story, was simple and terrible. Where was the line? At what point did protecting your legacy become mass murder? When did justice become vengeance? When did defending what was yours turn you into the thing you claimed to be fighting? A still represented time, Boone had said. 43 years of accumulated labor, knowledge, history. That was true. But 9 lives represented time, too. Bobby Jean Farmer's unborn child who never got to exist. James Earl Tucker's 3 children who grew up without a father. Dennis Crawford's wife who buried her husband at 38 and spent the next 40 years alone. The arithmetic was simple and terrible. 1 stolen still equaled 9 deaths. The equation balanced in Boone Slade's mind, balanced according to a code that predated law, that emerged from mountains where survival demanded harsh responses to theft. But did it balance morally? Did protecting legacy justify eliminating 9 people who'd made the mistake of profiting from stolen copper? These are questions each person must answer for themselves, because the story of the Slade brothers and the Moonshine War isn't really about stills or copper or even murder. It's about what we value, what we'll protect, what we'll sacrifice to preserve something that can't be replaced. It's about systems that fail to recognize certain kinds of loss, about communities that operate by codes the law doesn't acknowledge, about the terrible choices people make when everything they've built is taken and they have no legal recourse. In the end, Boone Slade protected his family's reputation. For decades after, no one stole from the Slades, no one challenged them, no one tested whether they'd respond to disrespect with violence. The code was reinforced through blood, and the mountains remembered, but the still itself was gone. The 43 years of history Boone had fought to protect were erased anyway, not by theft, but by time and consequence. No one wanted to inherit knowledge paid for with 9 lives. No one wanted to touch equipment associated with so much death. The Slade legacy died not because it was stolen, but because it became too heavy to carry, and that might be the most tragic part of this story. Boone Slade eliminated 9 people to protect something that died anyway, buried under the weight of blood and guilt and questions that have no good answers. The mountains keep their secrets well. They always have. 48 years after the first death, the hollows of Cocke County still remember the Moonshine War, still whisper about the Slade brothers and the price they demanded for a stolen still. But memory fades, details blur, and eventually, all that remains is a vague sense that something terrible happened here once, that 9 men died and 3 brothers were never punished, that justice and vengeance wore the same face and nobody could tell them apart. If this story makes you think about legacy, about the price we pay to protect what we value, about the line between defending what's yours and becoming what you fear, leave your like and share this video. Subscribe for more true stories that challenge what we think we know about right and wrong, about mountain justice and legal law, about how ordinary people become capable of extraordinary darkness when systems fail and old codes are all that remain. Comment below, where would you draw the line? What's worth protecting with violence? What legacy justifies 9 deaths? Because these stories aren't just history. They're happening now somewhere in forgotten places where codes replace institutions and desperate people make choices that shock us precisely because they mirror our own capacity for darkness when pushed far enough. Until next time, remember, the monsters we fear aren't always born that way. Sometimes they're made. 1 stolen still, 1 dismissed complaint, 1 desperate decision at a time. And the line between justice and murder is drawn not in law books, but in the human heart, where it's always been thinnest, always been easiest to cross, always been hardest to find our way back from. The violence ended on December 3, 1976, but the consequences stretched forward like shadows at sunset, touching lives that would never know why they carried weight they hadn't earned. Bobby Jean Farmer's daughter was born in March 1976, 3 months after her father died on a mountain road with cut brake lines. She grew up believing he'd died in an accident, A cruel twist of mechanical failure and bad timing. Her mother never told her the truth, never explained that her father had been eliminated as part of a calculated campaign of retribution over stolen copper. The girl, named Rachel, turned 47 in 2023, lives in Knoxville now, works as a nurse, has 2 children of her own. She knows her father hauled supplies for Moonshine operations, knows he lived in a world that existed outside the law. What she doesn't know is that he died because Walter Hutchins needed someone to move 200 pounds of sugar, and Bobby needed cash more than he needed to ask questions about who still he was supporting. James Earl Tucker's oldest son, Michael, was 12 when his father was shot in a ravine 3 miles from the nearest road. Michael is 59 now, never left Cock County, works maintenance at an elementary school in Newport. He spent his teenage years angry, his 20s drinking, his 30s trying to understand why his father had been eliminated in woods where he'd walked 1,000 times before. The sheriff's department told the family it was probably a hunting accident, someone who'd mistaken James for a deer and panicked. But Michael had seen the body before the funeral home worked on it, had seen the bullet hole in his father's chest, perfectly centered, no mistake about what the shooter had been aiming at. He knew it was murder, knew someone had wanted his father dead. What he never knew was why, never understood that his father had died not for anything he'd done, but for who he'd chosen to work for. Dennis Crawford's wife, Susan, was 34 when her husband was shot at a still site in October 1975. She raised 2 children alone, worked 3 jobs to keep food on the table, never remarried because the grief sat too heavy on her chest to make room for anything else. She's 82 now, lives in a nursing home in Sevierville, has good days and bad days, and on the bad days she still cries for Dennis, still asks why someone would eliminate a man whose only crime was needing work in an economy that offered none. Her children, both in their 50s now, scattered to different states, carry something in their eyes that people who grew up with fathers don't have, a particular kind of wariness, an understanding that safety is an illusion and violence can reach through the most ordinary afternoon and change everything. They don't know about Boone Slade, don't know about the stolen still, don't know their father was eliminated as a message, proof that consequences would be paid regardless of who stood in the way. The families of the 9 victims never got answers that satisfied the questions. The investigations closed, the cases filed as unsolved or accidental, the truth buried under insufficient evidence, and a system that couldn't acknowledge what it refused to see. For the wives and children and parents left behind, the deaths remained senseless, random violence in a world that already felt too hard, too cruel, too indifferent to suffering. They mourned, they survived, they carried forward the weight of loss that never quite healed, because closure requires understanding, and understanding was never offered. In a different version of this story, someone would have told them the truth, would have sat down with Susan Crawford and explained that her husband died because Walter Hutchins stole a still and Boone Slade demanded payment in blood, would have told Rachel Farmer that her father's brake lines were cut deliberately, that his death was murder made to look like accident, would have given Michael Tucker the knowledge that his father was shot by someone who knew exactly what they were doing, who killed with purpose and precision. But truth that serves no purpose other than pain is sometimes withheld, and the families of the 9 victims lived and died without knowing the full story of why their loved ones had been taken. The Slade brothers returned to something resembling normal life in the months after Walter Hutchins died. Boone went back to odd jobs, carpentry work, occasional welding, things that paid cash and asked no questions. Harlan found work at a sawmill that operated 6 months out of the year, spent the other 6 months hunting and fishing and sitting on his porch watching weather move through the mountains. Curtis drifted as he'd always drifted, working a few weeks here, a few weeks there, never settling into anything that required commitment or explanation. They didn't talk about what they'd done, didn't sit around reminiscing about the 18 months they'd spent tracking and eliminating 9 men. The work was finished, the message sent, the score settled as much as it ever would be. What remained was life, the slow accumulation of days that followed violence, the question of how to exist after you've crossed lines you can never uncross. Boone struggled with sleep for years after. Not nightmares exactly, just an inability to rest deeply, a sense that he needed to stay alert, to watch for threats that no longer existed. He'd wake at 3 in the morning, Clara Jean sleeping beside him, and sit at the kitchen table smoking cigarettes in the dark, thinking about Bobby Jean Farmer's truck going through the guardrail, about Dennis Crawford bleeding out at a still sight, about Walter Hutchins falling on his own porch with a hole in his chest. He felt no remorse exactly, but he felt something, a recognition that he'd changed himself in ways that couldn't be undone, that the man who'd gone to Walter Hutchins' property in July 1975, asking for his stillback, was different from the man who'd pulled the trigger in December 1976. The work had been necessary. Boone believed that, absolutely. The code demanded response, the theft required consequence, the legacy needed protection. But necessity didn't erase cost, and the cost was carried in Boone's chest, like a stone that never quite dissolved, never quite became light enough to forget. Clara Jean knew. Wives always know. She never asked directly, never demanded Boone confirm what she'd already figured out, but she knew. She'd been married to him for 24 years by the time the violence started, knew his rhythms, his moods, his capacity for action when pushed. She'd watched him come home from Korea with nightmares and scars, had seen how he carried the weight of things he'd done in service to survival. This was the same, different context, but same essence. Boone had gone to war again, this time in the mountains he'd been born in, against men he'd known all their lives. And like Korea, the war had taken something from him that couldn't be given back. Clara Jean didn't judge, didn't condemn, didn't offer absolution. She just stayed, made coffee in the mornings, sat with him in the evenings, bore witness to his silence, and understood that some things couldn't be spoken, only endured. Harlan drank more after Walter died. Not falling down drunk, not destructive, just steady drinking that started in the afternoons and continued until sleep. He'd sit on his porch with a bottle of whiskey, not the moonshine they'd once made, but store-bought liquor that tasted like chemicals and regret. And he'd drink until the memories softened, until the faces of the 9 men blurred into something less distinct, less accusatory. Harlan had eliminated 3 of them himself. Tommy Wright and Vernon Hayes and Kyle Bennett, had watched them die, had felt the recoil of the rifle or the impact of the truck or the cold calculation of making death look like accident. He'd done it because Boone asked, because family loyalty demanded it, because the code said consequences must be paid. But doing it left marks that whiskey couldn't quite erase, shadows that lived behind his eyes and made him look older than his years, more tired than labor alone could explain. Curtis talked to himself more after the war ended. Not madness exactly, but a running commentary that started in his late 40s and never quite stopped. A constant murmur of observation and question that he carried like background noise. People who didn't know him well thought it was eccentricity, harmless quirk of an old mountain man who'd lived alone too long. But family recognized it for what it was, the sound of a mind trying to process things it couldn't quite reconcile, trying to find peace with actions that defied peaceful resolution. Curtis had eliminated 2 men, Carl Messer and Eddie Malone, had done the work with the same nervous energy he brought to everything, quick and efficient, and then immediately second-guessing every choice. The talking helped somehow, gave voice to doubts that couldn't be shared with anyone else. created a dialogue with himself that substituted for the conversations he couldn't have with the world. The mountains absorbed the violence the way mountains always do, incorporating death into the landscape, making it part of the history that accumulated in layers like sediment. The hollows where men had died remained hollows. The roads where trucks had crashed remained roads. The ridges where bodies had fallen remained ridges. Time moved forward, seasons changed. New people moved in who knew nothing of the Moonshine War, who walked trails and drove roads without knowing what had happened there in 1975 and 1976. The physical evidence faded, washed away by rain, covered by leaves, reclaimed by forest. What remained were stories, fragments passed between people who remembered, details that shifted and changed with each telling until the truth became indistinguishable from legend and the legend became more real than fact. In Newport, in the bars where mountain people gathered, the story took on mythic proportions. Some versions had Boone Slade eliminating 15 men. Some had the war lasting 3 years. Some added details about federal agents and rival gangs that never existed. The core remained constant. The Slade brothers had gone to war over a stolen still and had won absolutely, had made the price so high that nobody would dare repeat the offense. Young men heard the story and learned the lesson, understood that certain lines couldn't be crossed without consequence, that certain families carried codes that superseded law. The violence served as cautionary tale, as warning, as proof that the old ways still held power in places the modern world hadn't fully penetrated. But other versions circulated too, darker interpretations that saw Boone Slade not as defender of legacy, but as murderer who'd used theft as excuse for violence he'd wanted to commit anyway. These versions focused on the 9 victims, on the families destroyed, on the disproportionate response to a crime that could have been handled differently. They asked questions about whether 43 years of still operation justified 9 deaths, about whether any legacy was worth that much blood, about what kind of man could eliminate 9 people and sleep at night. These versions didn't circulate as widely, weren't as popular, because they complicated a narrative that many people wanted simple. But they persisted in certain circles among certain families, keeping alive the possibility that the Slade brothers weren't heroes of mountain justice, but examples of how violence perpetuates itself, how codes become excuses, how men convince themselves that murder is something nobler when given the right framing. Agent Thomas Reynolds never stopped thinking about the case. He retired from the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation in 1992, moved to Chattanooga, spent his retirement years fishing and reading and trying to make peace with cases he'd never solved. The Slade investigation haunted him more than most because he'd known, had understood with moral certainty that Boone Slade and his brothers had eliminated 9 men, but he'd been unable to prove it in ways that mattered legally. The evidence existed in pattern and motive and opportunity, but not in fingerprints or witnesses or confession. Reynolds had sat across from Boone Slade at that kitchen table in February 1977 and had seen a man completely at peace with what he'd done, no guilt, no shame, just calm acceptance that he'd protected what needed protecting and paid the price his code demanded. That certainty, that absolute conviction in the rightness of his actions, terrified Reynolds more than rage would have, more than madness would have, because it suggested a worldview where 9 deaths could be justified, could be necessary, could be right. Reynolds died in 2009, heart disease, 78 years old. In his papers, his children found a file on the Slade case, thick with notes and theories and connections he'd never been able to prove. The last entry was dated June 2008, month before Boone Slade died, and it read, "Some men operate by codes older than law, and when those codes conflict with legal justice, which takes precedence? I spent my career enforcing law, but I grew up in mountains where code mattered more. Maybe that's why this case haunts me, because I understand both perspectives and can't reconcile them. Slade eliminated 9 men to protect legacy, and according to his code, he was right. According to my law, he was a murderer. Both things are true. Both things matter. And I'll die without knowing which truth weighs more. His children read the entry, didn't understand it, filed it away with other papers that documented a career spent chasing people who operated outside systems his children took for granted. The still itself disappeared completely. The pieces Walter Hutchins had sold, scattered across Tennessee, Kentucky, and North Carolina, melted down, repurposed, incorporated into things that had nothing to do with moonshine or mountain history. Some of the copper ended up in plumbing fixtures in a house in Lexington. Some became components in a still being built by someone who never knew its previous incarnation. Some was sold as scrap and disappeared into the industrial recycling stream, transformed so completely that no trace of its origin remained. Amos Slade's work, the still he'd built in 1932 with his own hands, with copper he'd shaped and soldered and fitted with the precision of someone who understood that equipment was legacy, was erased as thoroughly as if it had never existed. The 43 years of accumulated history, the knowledge embedded in its construction, the connection it represented to generations of Slade family moonshiners, all gone, sold for $800, scattered beyond recovery. And that erasure meant Slade had failed. He'd eliminated 9 men to protect legacy, but the legacy died anyway. No one wanted to continue the family tradition after the violence. No one wanted to inherit knowledge paid for with that much blood. Boone's daughters had already left the mountains, had married men who worked regular jobs, who lived in cities where moonshine was something quaint you bought at tourist shops, not something that defined identity and survival. They didn't want the still, wouldn't have known what to do with it if it had been recovered. The Slade legacy died not because Walter Hutchins stole it, but because the world had changed, because the mountains were changing, because the younger generation saw opportunity elsewhere and didn't want to carry forward traditions built on illegal work and violent codes. Boone understood this in his final years. He'd sit on his porch in the evenings, Clara Jean beside him, watching the sun set over ridges his family had occupied for 5 generations. And he'd understand that he'd won the battle but lost the war. He'd made sure nobody stole from the Slades again, had reinforced the code, had proven that consequences would be paid. But the code itself was dying, killed not by theft but by irrelevance, by a world where mountain justice mattered less each year, where federal law and modern economy and changing values eroded the foundations everything had been built on. The 9 deaths had protected nothing in the end, had only added weight to a legacy already too heavy for anyone to want to carry. He never expressed regret, not in words Clara Jean heard, not in conversations with his brothers, not in the long silences that characterized his final decade. Regret would have meant admitting the code was wrong, and Boone couldn't do that, couldn't acknowledge that maybe there had been another way. Maybe 9 deaths weren't necessary. Maybe legacy wasn't worth that price. To admit regret would be to betray everything he'd believed, everything the mountains had taught him, everything his grandfather and father had passed down. So he sat with his certainty, held it like armor against doubt, and carried the weight of 9 lives, ended until his own life ended, and the weight passed to others who mostly didn't know they were carrying it. The funerals told the story of how mountain communities process violence without acknowledging it directly. Slade's funeral in 2008 drew 40 people, family and old friends, people who'd known him all his life. The preacher, Reverend Charles Morton, who'd been minister at Mountain View Baptist for 30 years, gave a eulogy that focused on Boone's work ethic, his love for family, his connection to the land. The 9 deaths were never mentioned. The Moonshine War was never referenced. Anyone attending who didn't know the history would have heard about an ordinary man who'd lived an ordinary life in extraordinary landscape, who'd worked hard and loved his family and valued tradition. Only the careful listener would have caught the coded language, the references to Boone as someone who protected what was his and demanded respect and lived by principles that sometimes conflicted with the modern world. Those phrases carried weight for people who knew, signaled acknowledgement without confession, honored Boone's actions without explicitly endorsing them. Harlan's funeral in 2013 was smaller, maybe 20 people, the dwindling number reflecting how isolated he'd become in his final years. The eulogy was brief, respectful, largely empty of specific detail, because Harlan's life had been lived in the spaces between events, in the quiet accumulation of days that left few stories worth public telling. His sons attended, stood in the back of the church, left immediately after the service without speaking to anyone. They'd moved away decades before, had built lives that had nothing to do with mountains or moonshine or codes that justified violence. They'd loved their father in the complicated way children love parents, whose actions they can't fully reconcile, can't quite condemn, but can't quite embrace. Harlan was buried next to his wife Nadine, 50 years after she'd died, the reunion marked with a simple gravestone that listed dates of birth and death and nothing else. No epitaph, no summary of life, just the bare facts of existence and its end. Curtis Slade is still alive, though barely. At 88, dementia has erased most of what made him Curtis, has reduced him to fragments of memory that surface randomly, disconnected from context or chronology. On good days, he talks about growing up in Greer's Hollow, about hunting with his brothers, about his father teaching him to work copper. On bad days, he talks about blood and darkness and men falling, about voices in the woods and hands that won't come clean, no matter how much he washes them. The nursing home staff think it's confusion, the kind of agitation common in advanced dementia, neurons misfiring and creating phantom memories. They don't know it's real memory, trauma surfacing after decades of suppression, guilt that's been buried so long it's become indistinguishable from nightmare. Curtis will die soon, probably within the year, and when he does, the last direct link to the Moonshine War will be gone, the last person who carried first-hand knowledge of what really happened in those 18 months, between June 1975 and December 1976. But the story will persist, because stories always persist in mountains that remember. New versions will emerge, details will shift, the truth will continue its slow transformation into legend. 50 years from now, 100 years from now, people will still tell versions of the story about the Slade brothers and the Moonshine War, about how 3 men went to war over stolen legacy and eliminated 9 people without facing justice. The story will be told as warning, as entertainment, as history, as myth. It will be told in bars and around campfires, in true crime podcasts and YouTube videos, in books written by people who never knew the mountains, but understand that violence sells, that darkness attracts, that people are endlessly fascinated by the question of what we're capable of when pushed far enough. And that question is what makes this story matter, beyond the specific details of copper stills and mountain codes. Because the Slade brothers weren't monsters, weren't psychopaths, weren't anomalies outside normal human behavior. They were ordinary men raised in a specific culture, taught specific values, facing a specific problem with tools their upbringing had given them. They believed absolutely in what they were doing, believed it was right, believed it was necessary, believed it was just. And that's terrifying, not because they were different from us, but because they weren't. All of us carry codes, rules we live by, lines we think we'd never cross, values we'd protect even when protecting them costs something. The Slade brothers just followed their code further than most of us ever will, took protection to its logical extreme, demonstrated what happens when legacy becomes more important than life. The families of the 9 victims would have a different answer about what makes this story matter. For them, it's not philosophical question about codes and justice. It's personal reality of fathers who didn't come home, husbands who died for reasons that were never adequately explained, lives that were taken by men who were never punished. The story matters because 9 people died, because families were destroyed, because children grew up without parents, because the weight of loss doesn't diminish just because time passes or because the people responsible believed they were right. Susan Crawford, 82 years old in a nursing home, crying for a husband who's been dead for 48 years, doesn't care about mountain codes or legacy protection. She cares that Dennis was taken from her, that she raised children alone, that she spent half a century carrying grief that was never fully resolved. Both perspectives are valid. Both truths exist simultaneously. Boone Slade was a man protecting family legacy according to a code he believed was right. And Boone Slade was a murderer who eliminated 9 people, including some who were barely connected to the theft. Those realities don't cancel each other out. They coexist, creating the moral complexity that makes this story more than simple true crime narrative. Because if Boone was purely evil, the story would be easy. We'd condemn him and move on. And if he was purely righteous, we'd celebrate him and feel satisfied. But he was neither. He was complicated human, operating in that gray space where most real life actually happens, where motives are mixed and justifications are partial, and outcomes are tragic, regardless of intent. The question that haunts this story, that should haunt anyone who hears it, is what you would have done in Boone's position, not what you think you should do, not what moral philosophy or legal code or religious teaching says you should do, but what you actually would do if something that represented 43 years of family history was stolen, and the system refused to help recover it, and the thief mocked your request for its return. Would you walk away? Would you accept the loss? Would you let the theft stand and the thief profit? Or would you do what Boone did? Demand consequences, enforce your own code, make sure everyone understood that stealing from you carried a price higher than anyone would want to pay. The easy answer is that you'd walk away, that no legacy is worth 9 lives, that violence is never justified. But the easy answer comes from a position of safety, from a life where systems mostly work and theft mostly gets punished, and legacy mostly gets protected through legal means. The Slade brothers didn't have those luxuries, lived in a world where systems didn't recognize their loss and couldn't protect their legacy and wouldn't punish the theft. So they became their own system, their own law, their own justice, and 9 men died, and the legacy was lost anyway. And Boone Slade lived another 31 years carrying weight that never quite became bearable. And the families of the victims carried their own weight, their own grief, their own questions that never got answered. And the mountains remembered and forgot simultaneously, holding the story while letting details fade, maintaining the essential shape while losing the specific texture. This is how violence persists in places where codes predate law, where old ways still hold power, where the modern world touches but doesn't quite transform, not through constant warfare, not through continuous bloodshed, but through examples like the Slade brothers, through stories that reinforce the code while demonstrating its cost, through legends that teach both the power of protecting legacy and the price that protection demands. The Appalachian Moonshine War ended in December 1976, but it never really ended. It continues in the choices people make about what they'll protect and what they'll sacrifice, about where they draw lines and when they cross them, about how they balance justice and vengeance and survival. It continues in the families carrying weight they didn't choose, in the children raised without fathers, in the old men dying with memories they can't quite process. It continues in the hollows and ridges of Cock County, in the houses built where moonshine operations once operated, in the trails walked by people who don't know what happened here but feel something heavy in the air, something unresolved, something that demands acknowledgement even as it resists full understanding. The war is over. The violence ended. The participants are dead or dying, but the questions remain, sharp and immediate, demanding answers we can't quite give, forcing us to look at what we'd do, what we'd sacrifice, what we'd become to protect what we value most. And that's where this story lives now, not in the past, but in the present, in the moment, when you ask yourself what you'd be willing to pay, what you'd be willing to become, what you'd be willing to lose to protect something that can't be replaced. The Slade brothers gave their answer. 9 lives. 48 years later, that answer still echoes through mountains that remember everything and forgive nothing.